Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of 2Costa Rica Real Talk, 2Costa Rica Real Estate's podcast on all things real estate and Costa Rica. And today we're joined once again by Todd Cutter, managing broker of 2Costa Rica Real Estate. How are you doing today, Todd?
I'm doing fantastic. And yourself?
A little bit under the weather, but such is life in the tropics, so something you get used to.
Seems like a sick ward here at the office for the past few weeks, but we're all getting over it. So good to see you on the mend.
Yeah, and it's a nice sunny day, so things flow easier that way.
Absolutely.
Today, I wanted to talk about like the iconic sales that happen in real estate. Not thinking of one specific sale, perhaps, not really thinking of like the house that was sold, but more like the experiences and like the anecdotes that happen throughout like the real estate selling process.
Sure. How long do we have?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it like under half an hour, perhaps.
We can do it.
But perhaps first of all, like as an introduction, how's that initial process of like not getting really like in-depth explanation, but just like a general overview of like the sale process that when it ensues in Costa Rica real estate?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, first and foremost, the agent's responsibility is to have their mouth shut and their ears open, right? Which is hard sometimes for salespeople, right? So making sure as an agent that they take the time to ask questions and then close their mouth and listen to what the clients have to say to gain a better understanding and a clear understanding of what clients are looking for. Not all clients know exactly what they're looking for, so it's really important to provoke leading questions to understand everything from location to architectural style to overall setting, and then take that information and translate it as an agent and go do their job to make sure that they find the right properties for the client. Obviously, setting clear expectations and making sure we don't waste our clients' time is a critical part of the process. Once we go out, then find the right properties, obviously show the right properties. The client makes a selection or goes through a Q&A process to understand the strengths and weaknesses of any particular properties, and typically ask the opinion of our agents, right? After having listened to what that criteria is, how does this fit? What do you think? Can my kids go to school in this area? Is this a good investment property? Whatever the criteria might be, to make sure that we've properly vetted the property for the expectations of the client. And then we go into a negotiation process where our agents play a critical role in assisting those buyers if we're working with buyers, or assisting those sellers if we're working with sellers, to make sure that we do everything we can to represent their interest and in the negotiation process. Once we reach a negotiation, then we would go into what's called a due diligence period, where the buyer would have the opportunity to look under the hood, so to speak, make sure that everything is as they expect it to be, everything from legal to property inspections, and anything else that they need to uncover to make sure that they're comfortable and they understand what it is they're purchasing. During that time period, there's typically a deposit in escrow that's refundable during the due diligence period. And then once the due diligence period is over and assuming satisfactory results, that money would then go hard in escrow. The balance would be deposited in escrow. And we would work alongside their attorneys, buy and sell side attorneys, to work through the closing process until we reach a deed transfer.
And as you mentioned, like something that perhaps people have like the prejudice about like real estate transactions is that it doesn't really work like as a catalog buy or sell process. As you mentioned, there are like a whole lot of like things come into the equation, and as you mentioned, like agents, this idea of agents as trusted advisors is really integral to the whole process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, real estate is an emotional purchase for buyers and for sellers, the purchase or the sale. As you mentioned, it's not a catalog purchase. Yes, we've had transactions where buyers will purchase a property having looked at pictures on the internet, but that's obviously not common. And understanding the true needs, desires, hopes, and expectations of a buyer is really important in the agent being able to uncover the right property for the client. And I think that the great agents, not just at 2Costa Rica Real Estate, but around the world, are the ones that are capable of listening to what the clients say, but also reading between the lines about what they're not necessarily saying, and then asking the right questions to provoke the answers that the agent really needs to be able to find the right match. And it is a process, and it is an emotional process. Real estate obviously carries with it tremendous emotion, oftentimes for positive reasons when people are buying a new home or they're moving up in the world because they got a job promotion. But oftentimes it also has negative connotations when the sad histories in life happen, divorce, death, economic strife, and the other things that are all part of life. And so an agent, you use the word trusted advisor. An agent needs to be a trusted advisor. An agent, we joke oftentimes at the office that we're psychologists as well, because an agent needs to be able to listen. An agent needs to be the stable force throughout a transaction, the equilibrium. When the boat gets rocky, the agent is typically the one that everyone calls to look for solutions. And while the emotions of a transaction inevitably get to all agents, it is critical, particularly when we talk about iconic sales, that an agent remains even keeled, and that an agent is always a source of calm, is always a source of peace for buyers and sellers when those emotions start to get triggered in the transaction.
And now that you touch upon the idea of like iconic sales, for you, what entails like an iconic sale? I kind of like did like a little brief outline, but for you personally.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about an iconic sale, I think in most people's head is a price tag, right? What is the home in that community that had never been sold before? The price point in that community or that area that had never been reached before? What is the biggest, sexiest home that you can possibly imagine, whether it's beachfront, ocean view, overlooking the city? That's part of it. I think iconic, just like the word luxury, can be translated in a number of ways. And I think iconic beyond price, to me, is just one of those irreplaceable properties. It's a property that, regardless of its price, truly could not be replaced, or would be very, very difficult to replace. And of course, when you talk about an iconic sale or an iconic transaction, those transactions tend to be fairly challenging. They tend to carry twice the emotion on buy and sell side, typically on the sell side, because the seller knows they have something iconic. They're very attached to it, not just financially, less so financially, and probably much more so emotionally. And likewise, a buyer of an iconic property, they probably own more than one iconic property, and therefore they're used to that negotiation process. And so it really takes a true professional to carry out the iconic sales, whether you're in Costa Rica or any part of the world.
And perhaps to start off like with our little list of like iconic transactions. The first one, perhaps like the most talked about, tends to be like the complicated transaction. That one that you just at one point you perhaps think of like giving up, and you see everything like doom laden, that's no hope, and at the end of the day, just like as the buzzer beater in basketball, you managed to get through.
There's so many of those that I wouldn't know where to start. I think to that point, these iconic transactions almost always tend to be somewhat complex. I don't know complicated is the right word, but they are very complex. They tend to, when I think of the iconic transaction, that's the enormous home in the premier community with an unbeatable location, immense in size, and therefore a very high price point. They tend to be buyers and sellers who don't need the asset. They tend to be a seller who isn't necessarily looking to cash out. They tend to be a buyer who could go buy anything they want. Doesn't necessarily need to buy this one. They're clearly interested in it. And so you deal with unique emotions in a transaction like that because neither party is emotionally tied to it. Typically in those transactions, both parties are very experienced in real estate. Typically both parties are not scared of a negotiation. Typically both parties can become confrontational when the rocks get in the way, and they're very used to. I would say they're used to being in charge, and they're used to calling the shots. These are very successful business people, regardless of their walks of life, and they have the money that they have because they have achieved greatness in whatever their field is. And while they may or may not be experts in real estate per se, they don't shy away from a negotiation. And just because you get a signed contract, which is typically that moment where an agent breathes and says, "Ooh, we made it. We've got an agreement. We're going into due diligence." And in the iconic transactions, that's the start. And there's almost always 10 or 12 new negotiations, not necessarily about price, but over the course of the process, there are things that come up. And yeah, there are points in those transactions where the lighthearted will struggle, and where it really requires a tremendous level of emotional intelligence and maturity, thick skin, when the agent becomes an easy target for perhaps blame that's happening on the other side of the transaction, buy or sell side. An agent needs to sit back and understand that we're not necessarily the target of blame or responsibility of what's taking place in that transaction, but we're the people that are answering the phone. We're the people that are responding to emails. We're the people that are always on the front line, so to speak, intermediating both parties if we're representing both sides of the transaction, or in discussions with the other side's representative, buy or sell side. And it really requires, once again, that emotional intelligence to be able to place yourself in the shoes of the buyer or seller. What is motivating that confrontation, if it's a confrontation? What is motivating that desire to renegotiate? Is there justification in that renegotiation that's taking place? And how do you transmit that and put yourself in the shoes of the party that's on the other side so that you can reach a win-win situation for both parties? And yeah, there's been transactions, countless transactions where, I'm 50% through, so I think. And, a grenade gets dropped in the middle of transaction. And it's 10 steps forward and 20 steps back, and then you recover from that minor hiccup, and you go a week ahead, and there's another grenade that gets dropped in there, and we're problem solvers. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the great agents are sought out because of their ability to see things differently than others, their ability to find tremendously challenging problems and finding solutions for those that make both parties feel good. At the end of the day, that's part of what we have to do, is make sure that our clients feel good about what they're doing. No one wants to buy or sell a home and not feel good about the decision they made, or the house that they bought, or the house that they sold. And so, yeah, I mean, we can talk off mic about specifics, but there's been plenty of them. And at the end of the day, I guess the most rewarding part, despite the ups and downs, the headaches, the near heart attacks, and everything that can take place, is when you get to the end of it and you're able to bring buyer and seller together, have them walk away from a transaction greatly appreciative of what you added to the transaction and the value that you brought. That's the rewarding part of the transaction. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, well, and those experiences tend to be the ones, at least from what you hear, that build character for the agents. Those are the ones that tend to be like more emphasized, like in a conference, OFCO, or like in a kind of like a collective setting, like as they call, like the war wounds, so the scars of war.
Absolutely. I mean, I tell agents all the time, you don't learn from the easy transactions. They're great. Don't get me wrong. I love a transaction that's seamless from start to finish, but you don't learn much from those. And where, as a broker in my case, as an agent in the case of our agents, when things get complicated and you're able to solve those problems, and frankly, even when you can't, even when a transaction falls apart, despite your best efforts to keep it together, those are the ones, yes, they build character, but they also build a better agent. They build a more knowledgeable agent. They build an agent that's now prepared on the next transaction to watch out for whatever it is that blew up that transaction. And the next time that they have a colleague in the office that's going through a transaction, they'll share their experience and say, hey, you need to watch out for this particular new issue with a financial regulation or an escrow situation, or some legal hiccup that got in the way. And that allows us as agents and brokers to be able to better service our clients, and not make the same mistakes twice if it was a mistake, to prevent errors, whether they were our errors or not, be able to intervene and help to avoid those errors in the future. And
as you mentioned, like perhaps the seamless transaction tends to be mostly circumstantial, perhaps, like depends on the buyer, the seller, depends even on financial climate, like very, very many things that are beyond the agent's hands. But what can an agent learn from like a perfect transaction? Because at times it might be like even like suspicious, like, this was very, very easy. What can I take from this?
Yeah, well, I think that like the complicated transactions, as I said a minute ago, it's hard to learn from an easy one. But I think the devil is in the details. And if you look at what you refer to as an easy transaction or a seamless transaction, it's important for an agent, to do, the post-mortem, as I say, after a transaction, really to sit back and say, okay, what took place here? Why was this easy? Was it because it was lucky? Was it because I just did a great job as an agent in hearing what they were looking for, matching it up, and things really just clicked? Did I do a good job preparing the seller to sell their property as far as price education, as far as having all their due diligence documents together? There's clearly something beyond luck that makes transactions seamless. And so, I've had seamless transactions, for example, where a buyer either calls, writes in, or has a meeting with me, and they're like, that's the property that I want. Well, I later found out after closing, and this client had been looking for real estate for 2 years. Mm-hmm. He had been through 7 agents already, and he later told me after the closing that every time he sat down with them, the agent never asked him what he was looking for. He gave him the budget, said the area that he wanted to be in, and they, spewed out a list of 10 to 12 properties. He looked at them all and discarded them all. He walked into my office. He was referred to me by another agent who, I don't want to say had given up, but basically had given up. and he came in and said, I want to see this house and that house. And I said, let me stop, because I need to understand who you are and what you're looking for, because I don't want you to waste your time. Mm-hmm. I know you're an extremely busy business person. And he looked at me and he's like, wow, no one's asked me that yet. Long story short, I showed him one house. He walked in, he said, this is the one that I want. So in retrospect, someone could say, well, that was really easy. He walked in, he saw one house. I showed him one house after one meeting with him, and he made an offer, and we closed on the transaction 30 days later. On the surface, easy transaction. When I do my post-mortem there, I can pat myself on the back and say what I did right was I didn't make him waste his time. I didn't waste my time. And that made it easy for him, and it made it easy for me. On the sell side of things, in that transaction, I happen to represent buyer and seller. The seller, the price on the property was a little high, but I had educated the seller prior to going into the fact that I didn't think he was going to get close to that figure in a negotiation. And it was important that if and when a serious cash offer was brought to the table, that he needs to at least take it into consideration and try not to lose the opportunity, because it was an iconic sale. It was a very unique property that didn't have a large target audience. And so I think, to your point, the easy ones still have lessons to be learned if you start to pick at why they were easy. If you have a seller who you represent and you're like, wow, that guy was just super prepared. Well, what can I learn from that? Make sure your sellers in the future are prepared. Make sure whether it was the pricing or whether it was the furniture or whether when the property went under contract, did the seller say, here's a zip file with all 25 or 30 due diligence documents from tax payments to municipal declarations to everything. Hey, that made the process easy for him. It made it easy for the buyer. It made the buyer and his attorney less suspicious that anything was going to be wrong because they were so prepared. It made the organization. And so the lesson there is make sure you educate your sellers to be prepared to sell.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, like each transaction doesn't really exist purely in a vacuum. Because you mentioned, like it might seem easy, but they stand on the foundations you've already built as an agent or like as a realtor.
Absolutely. And sometimes, like I said, and not to take credit, right? Sometimes it had nothing to do with me. Sometimes the seller in that transaction that I just mentioned, he's just an organized person, right? Or he and his wife are super organized, or his secretary had gone through great lengths, as a recent transaction I did when we went into due diligence. And I said, here's the due diligence list. And the personal assistant of the seller handed us an AMPO folder of, color-coded, coordinated documents of everything from A to Z the day after the request came in. So I had nothing to do with that. I, frankly, had not told that seller, hey, you need to make sure that you have this like this and this order and everything else. I learned from that because I know that the buyer's attorney, when they saw that, were like, wow, that's a sign of what we're buying, and it provides and exudes a tremendous level of confidence. And so whether the agent is actually responsible sometimes for why it was a seamless or easy transaction, doesn't mean that you can't learn from the positive things that other people brought to the table.
And like the final example I wanted to touch upon was this idea, not necessarily like a complex transaction, but the unlikely match, if we keep like this analogy with relationships.
Sure.
Like the counterintuitive one, like someone comes and they tell you to your face, this is what I want. At the end of the day, they say, no, actually, this thing I initially discarded is actually what I've always been dreaming of.
Yeah, I've had so many of them, and I can think of two off the top of my head, and I won't mention names for confidentiality reasons, but I had one client, a very prominent businessman from Costa Rica who had a very specific criteria. We had shown him everything on the market, everything got discarded, and we had one home that didn't really fit what he was looking for, but it was one of those white elephants that had to have a very unique buyer. And I said to the agent in the office, you need to go show your client this home. And the agent said to me, why would I show that? Like, that's not at all what he's looking for. And I said, give him the disclaimer and make sure that you tell him, hey, I know this doesn't fit what you told me, but I think there's some characteristics about this house that really fit who you are as a person and is probably worth 20 minutes to go have a look. If you don't like it, no big deal. And just like you mentioned, he walked into the house in 2 seconds. He's like, wow, this is exactly what I've been looking for, even though it was not at all what he had told us he was looking for. And he bought the house. We recently resold the house several years later for him. And so it was just a lesson also to be learned for an agent, which is to never assume anything. Mm-hmm. And I had another instance where I had a client who texted me at 5 a.m, a very quirky, odd text that came in a foreign language. That's, I want to go look at the nicest house that you have. I only want to look at one. My agent is sick and I don't want to wait for them. And I got to go at 9:00. And the one home that I had in mind was a home that was off market. It wasn't on the market anymore. And I knew the sellers weren't motivated, but it was the premier home. It was the iconic home. And I told this person who I'd never met, who randomly reached out via text, I said, if you want to go see the house that you want, I need a copy of your passport. I need to know your client form. I need a business reference, a legal reference from your attorney here in Costa Rica, and I need proof of funds. Because I can't approach the seller without any of that documentation, because I need to show that you're for real. Mm-hmm. And within 2 minutes, I had all the information from this buyer. She sent it to me immediately, because buyers like that are used to having to go through filters like that to see homes of that value. I sent it to the seller and said, hey, I know your property's off market, but here's who wants to see the home. They want to see it in 2 hours. Here's their proof of funds, their legal reference, and all the documentation. The seller was blown away with the diligence with which we had approached the situation to protect their best interest. The buyer had no issue in doing it. And the buyer walked in and didn't speak English or Spanish. But when we got out to the front yard, they asked to take a picture with me. So that I knew that was a good sign that they were likely to buy. They ended up buying the home. And it was a great experience, like you said, of a totally unexpected transaction that when the text came in the morning, I was suspicious of it. I thought there's no way this is going to happen, and it ended up being one of those true iconic sales.
And also, given the context of Costa Rica, perhaps, given that the diversity of like each areas and regions, does that tend to happen from what you experienced more than in other places, that someone perhaps sees like a kind of like perhaps lifestyle or architectural preference and then like ends up like switching midway through a process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you think about it, for most people, if you look at our marketplace, most of our marketplace is not primary residence. We do offer services in the Central Valley, and we have some people that are buying primary residence at the beach, but most of these homes are second and third homes. And so some people come into the process with a preconceived notion, maybe because of their home that they have back in Atlanta or in California or New York or wherever they're from. And they get here and they get into the ether of Costa Rica, and they're in, Tamarindo, they're in Manuel Antonio or Dominical or Santa Teresa or Nosara, wherever they are, and they just get a feeling, right? And they're in a home that has nothing to do with what they had previously described to us and what they had envisioned in their mind, but it feels right. And this is it. And you look at it and you're like, this is a colonial home. You said contemporary, or this is contemporary and you said colonial, and it doesn't matter anymore because it's all about the emotions. Real estate in when you talk about a lifestyle purchase, a second home purchase, there's so much emotion involved. And so it's great, frankly, to see buyers that allow themselves to get outside of their own preconceived box and just allow themselves to feel what's right for them.
Yeah, it's funny because at the end of the day, we always come back to these analogies, like almost like a matchmaking TV show, like find your ideal partner, and perhaps it's an unlucky match, perhaps it's like the seamless fit, perhaps it's like a rocky path along the way. But at the end of the day, what's important is that like getting to know that emotional aspect, as you mentioned, like that intangible part of like the transaction.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, Costa Rica and anywhere in the world, I think a lot of people, find the unlikely match. And then there are others who find the exact match they thought they wanted. And 2 years later, they realized it wasn't the right place for them. And it's, I get the question like, why would the seller be selling this home? It's amazing. It's perfect. It's this, it's that. It didn't feel right, right? There was nothing wrong with the house. It's just part of the process, and you see that's part of the real estate life cycle. Is that people change and their desires change and their needs change and their interest and their priorities change. And that's why people buy and sell real estate all the time, all over the world. And it's, for me, just a true joy to be a part of the process and watch it, whether I'm actually involved in the transaction or I'm just helping as a broker some of the agents to bring their clients' dreams to fruition. It's just a fun process.
Any final words or closing thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think, as a company, 2Costa Rica Real Estate has been blessed to be a part of so many iconic transactions. And when you think about it, like I said, the word iconic, we've broken records in most of the markets where we serve clients and break records, from a price perspective to, the highest price per square meter in a community or the highest gross price in that community, or just those iconic postcard properties that you could never replace again. We've been so fortunate to have been entrusted by buyers and sellers to help them buy or sell those properties. And I guess I would just like to close by thanking our buyers and sellers who have entrusted us with their invaluable assets, knowing what goes on during those iconic transactions and the fact that they've entrusted us to carry out their legacies if it's a sale process, or to help find the legacy that they're going to leave for the rest of their family if it's a purchase process. And we look forward to continue to doing it for decades to come.
Great. Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great being back again, and hope you can get on the mend here soon.
Thanks. This was a very interesting and insightful episode. Kind of like mixing pop psychology with like a real estate expertise. So it's always fun here. And if you enjoyed the conversation, you can follow us on social media at 2Costa Rica Real Estate and see all our backlog with podcasts in your favorite streaming platform at 2Costa Rica Real Talk.